Hi class. So today we're going to be talking about this is our third unit, I believe. Yeah, we're talking about Neruda, right? Pablo Neruda, interesting character. We're going to spend this first lecture doing a little bit of talking about some biographical information, not in terribly much detail because you guys have already done a lot of that baseline research. Then we're going to spend a little bit of time on in the same video, we'll spend a bit of time on kind of the historical context and the greater complications that can come up here. And then the second lecture, we'll spend time talking about particularly the poems that we decided to talk about for class this semester. A lot of what we're going to talk about with Neruda will be interesting in a couple ways because it'll have a lot to do with who we talk about next, who you should already see up on the course website. Nazim Hikmet has a lot of very similar unfortunate tangles with being super duper pro-fascist. So we'll get around to that in different ways, talking about how we feel about that, how does that impact the art, should it impact our discussions of the art, and so on and so forth. So Pablo Neruda, right? Very basic level, right? Probably in the very easily in the conversation for the greatest poet of the 20th century, right? I will say there's a little asterisk that comes to that in the sense that I think it's probably the greatest Western poet is probably the better conversation there because a lot of the people having that conversation aren't taking into account our friends from the Eastern Hemisphere, but incredibly prolific, right? Very very fundamental to the shape of how poetry works, not just in Spanish and Latin American countries and their literary spheres, but also through to English and honestly nearly any kind of like Western, European, and South American influenced spectrums of poetics, right? For most people, for example, and we'll talk about this a lot when we get to poetics, like Neruda is the baseline of what an ode looks like, which is interesting because it's historically a Greek form, right? It comes from the ancient Greeks. We'll talk a little bit about that at other points, but Neruda is probably the benchmark for what has become the modern ode, right? Which is always fascinating because we do not end up seeing as much of Neruda in our English classes as is expected of someone with the breadth of impact as his work has had, right? Oftentimes, interestingly, the reason that that he doesn't show up in discussions of English canon is because he's in translation, and therefore there is a mark put against it. Somehow, reading these and discussing their impact is not as necessary or formative or crucial to the understanding of how did poetry end up in the place that it is versus where it was before him. A foolish notion, and I tend to think that if a professor is kind of purporting that to be the case, you probably don't need to care what they think about poetics, but whatever, right? It's kind of its own politics within the teaching of literature, right? Some just general notes, right? Born in 1904, you guys should know that. Much more than in a different context to the way that we talk about Du Fu as being, quintessentially Chinese and Basho being quintessentially Japanese. Neruda is very Chilean. It is an interesting thought to argue whether or not he is quintessentially Chilean, right? If his poetry demonstrates an intrinsic part of Chilean culture in a way that isn't that is more defining of his work than what I would otherwise argue to be he is nationalistically Chilean, right? But that is a broader a broader philosophical argument to be sure, but I think it's one to keep in interest, right? Do we feel like his poetry shows aspects of the Chilean culture, or is at least talked about in such a way that demonstrates that it highlights crucial and very fundamental parts of Chilean culture in the 20th century versus being kind of political, right? Or more interested in the auspices of Chile as a nation or as a state rather than otherwise, right? Obviously, very politically involved, which is something I guess he does share in some sense with Du Fu, right? Wanted to serve the public. Neruda moves into the diplomatic service, right? An interesting note, which is always like semi-depressing if you've been out trying to make a name for yourself. The dude's getting well known for his poetry at age 13. That's hard, right? There's no kind of discounting the fact that he was incredibly capable as a wordsmith, as a poet, right? And because of that, his work spans a very large swath of the 20th century. What I think gets lost in kind of just saying that is how many particular events that would encompass, right? So let's think about this, right? 1904, becomes famous at 13, right? So that means it's around 1917, right? World War One's in its kind of like back end arc, right? This is before some of the more this is before what we consider modernism as like a movement and like a moment in literature, which comes post World War One into World War Two, right? In that like gap, right? The modernists are popping up in England after he's already started to write and be prolific, right? World War II, all of the Stalinists era of the Soviet Union. He passed before the Soviet Union dissolved, but all of Stalin's reign, right? The Spanish Civil War. There's just so much, and then that's discounting all of the specific political unrest and moments of coups and foreign interference and so on and so forth that happen in Chile, right? So it's really, really, really incredible block of time to be existing and producing, right? And for it to be from someone who is politically active, right? And who ostensibly has an eye to the greater discussion of how these things should be flowing, right? He was a consul or a diplomat to Spain and to Mexico, right? And is the national poet of Chile, right? Just, of course, right? However, right, we talk about that political leaning, right? And I specifically phrased the questions for the first part of the unit to ask you to go do a little digging because I was curious how you guys would respond to this, right? Thankfully, in modern times, communism is somewhat less, at least in like earnestly functioning circles of discussion, not so much of a boogeyman word, right? This was not the case for pretty much all of Neruda's life, and most certainly, I would argue, has something to do with the fact with him not popping up to the amount he is owed in most discussions of poetic canon, right? However, what I was curious if you guys would kind of pick up on here is the affiliation with communism in and of itself, not a problem, right? To most modern persons, right, who are operating reasonably, that's not the problem, and it shouldn't be the problem. The bigger issue for Neruda, right, and we're going to see this problem pop up again with Nazim Hikmet, right, is that it wasn't just that he was a communist, right, which he was a lifelong communist, is that he was specifically a Stalinist, which is a distinct problem, and is a distinct thing to be, right? If your history education has failed you and you do not understand exactly why Stalin is such a goddamn nightmare, you need to go do a little bit of reading. There are millions dead thanks to Stalin, and plenty of people tortured, disappeared, smothered off the face of the earth. horrible, nightmarish monster of a dictator that used a communist regime to bring himself to power and those in his kind of immediate wing and favor. Right? This was not a Stalinism is not communism. It's fascism in its own sense. Right? And it's problematic that Neruda was super down with this. Right? Flipping through the book, right, as it is, right, you probably can pretty quickly come across the fact that there are a number of poems that are super hell yeah Stalin in here, or they are really pro-Soviet Union in the era of Stalin, right? This is inherently complicating, right, because they're not necessarily exaltations of the ideals of communism, right? They are this specific office and edifice of communism is a good thing and what it's doing should be celebrated. This obviously rubs a lot of people the wrong way, like a rough way, right? And I think very understandably and reasonably so, right? Kind of being in the pocket of this mindset, this political nightmare of a machine, is something that should stand as some sort of asterisk that we have to address, right? So a bunch of you, for example, talked about that you were really surprised that he got the Nobel Prize because he was a communist. On some level, like, no, cool. That's pretty surprising on some levels, right? But ostensibly, right, if the office of the Nobel laureacy is functioning correctly, which is a whole other problem, that shouldn't have precluded him, right? But it does sway to greater thought now and then. I wouldn't have been super surprised if it wasn't as much of a hurdle as you'd think, because, as we'll talk about in a second, a lot of intellectuals were interacting in that space of discussions of communism. However, right, the other prize, which not as many of you touched base on, which I think is interesting, is that he received the Stalin Prize in Literature, which was like the Soviet Union's version of the Nobel laureacy, right? This is the exemplary idea of Stalin's, best version of what a poet looks like, which is a little scary, right? Like, you can be really good at something, but if someone you really, really, really is a bad person tells you you're good at it, it doesn't feel great, right? But this was a big point of pride for Neruda and for others who received it during the era. Later in the Soviet existence, during de-Stalinization, where they kind of tried to take the stink of Stalin off of some of the Soviet artifice, it was put back to being the Lenin Prize, right? But he got the Stalin Prize, and he was super stoked about it, right? The thing that a lot of people don't put together about both of these is that they are not just you get an award and high fives and claps all around. They come with a substantial cash award, right? It is a prize, right? The Stalin Prize also came with quite a bit of money, and knowing that it comes kind of directly from Stalin's regime should tell you kind of how that money is acquired, right? Which should be an ethical concern for anyone thinking clearly, right? Or with conscience, I should think. However, this isn't the only award that Neruda nor Hikmet, as we'll talk about, received. There are many, many, many smaller ones. These moments where particular poems pop up, for example, and there's a couple we will read, but where it's talking about, the Red Armies at the gates of Prussia and things like that. A lot of these were almost essentially commissioned by the Soviet Union to act as propaganda pieces, right? We want high art that praises, the Stalinist regime's, the Soviet Union in its doing of a thing, right? Exalt us, and we'll literally just pay you. They just cut checks, right? A lot of artists did the arithmetic of, do I want no money or do I want money? And decided money is the answer, right? And all in on this train. Neruda did apparently express some regret to this later in life, but he still benefited quite substantially from selling out to a dictator, right? It's something that is, I believe, is disingenuous to ignore, right? There is a lot of discussion to be had about whether or not the consumption of a piece of an artist's work, when the artist themselves is a problem, which Neruda is, in fairness, a problem on like a personal level. Like, despite the fact that even from a feminist angle, there's a note in, I believe, one of his autobiographies that essentially just details the sexual assault of a younger woman. It's no, like, this is not okay, right? But there's this discussion, like, can we consume that which comes from a problematic person, right? And do so, I suppose the real core of the question is, can we do so without guilt, right? Or without shame, right? I think it's a complicating factor, right? Like, my benchmark for it, personally, and this is not to be prescriptive to you. If you have a different line that you draw, that's your personal decision to make, right? People judge people based on their own lines, and you will judge yourself based on your own lines, right? For me, it's, first thing, is the person alive to benefit from this anymore? If no, okay, I can do that. Precludes me that pushes me towards thinking that I might be able to consume this material. Right. Second, is the problematic thing that this artist is associated with furthered or benefited by my consumption of this work? If I think the answer is no, okay, even more reason to give it a look and start to examine it. Right. The third little asterisk for me is the work specifically designed to speak to exalt, to feature, is the work about the problematic thing, like, or done in service of that problematic thing? Then I think, whether they're dead or not, they have an estate, whatever, all the other things go out the window in terms of, do I think this is something that we should praise? And the answer is no. I think we can read it and we can examine it, explore it for not just as a piece of art, but also inherently sort of a failing of art in some ways. But I don't think we get to enjoy it, or we should not endeavor to enjoy it. It should be a look at best, the fulfillment is, we are observing the tragedy of a talent being wasted on doing something abhorrent. Okay. Again, you may feel differently. I specifically wanted to push this lecture all the way to the back end of Neruda until you guys were pretty much done, because I did not want to weigh on how you felt about it. Okay. But before we move into Hikmet, I think it's fair for me to at least bring to the table how I look at most of these things, and I don't want it to color how you think about it. If you're doing the assignments and you're fulfilling all the questions I ask you to answer, we're good. Okay. It's just for me, with Neruda and with Hikmet both, we get to situations where otherwise useful poems, or beautiful pieces of work, are tainted irrevocably by their association with being pro-Stalin, right? In my opinion, right? This is a big argument that many people have about Neruda, and I just think it fair to explain where I come down on it, okay? Kind of a corollary to this, right? So we talked about how the Soviet Union was spending a lot of money to get artists to essentially create art that exalts the ideas of the Soviet Union, or praises the Soviet Union, or any such things. They were not alone in this. The CIA had an entire office dedicated to it, and I'm sure many, many, many Western allies were doing the same, right? Art as a vehicle for ideological propaganda is not a new idea that the Soviet Union came up with, nor were they alone in doing it at the time, right? And I think it important for us to consider the artwork in which we believe this to be taking place in accordance with any ideology, with a bit of a grain of salt, right? Like, is this just propaganda, or is this actually a piece of art that just happens to have associations with ideas that are often sometimes also associated with this other thing. It's different, right? I personally think just because of where many of us will come from, coming out of a Western education system, and specifically for many out of an American education system, we are just inherently primed to look at pro-Soviet stuff as being super obvious, right? But there's an entire subgenre that's just essentially Americana, right? And beyond that, we have a long history of co-opting the arts to propagandize, and it happens just the same. We are in the throes of the culture, which makes us less likely to immediately see it as being very obviously strange and ideological because of the way our structured learning of how we interact with media and the environment and ideals of what it means to be American on a political sense filter down to us as we grow up, right? I think you have to learn to notice the ones from your kind of your own neck of the woods, where the ones from elsewhere become a little bit more apparent. And again, there is just a bit of an extra whiff of problem with some of the figures that Neruda particularly chooses to associate himself with, right? We also have some other context that can really highlight why the West might not be super down with Neruda in a lot of ways, and it's kind of come back around, thankfully, in recognizing the greatness of specific pieces of work. If you have any interest in why the United States might not have been super excited about him, go and do a little bit of research about our involvement in Pinochet coming to power, right? Who is the person who came right after as Neruda was sick, and it has been re-autopsied and such accordingly to suggest that he did indeed die naturally, but there was a strong reason to believe for a great deal of time that he was essentially assassinated by a dictatorship that we were not clean of helping get where it was. We'll put that as the most mild way of describing it. Okay, so Neruda's politics did not endear him to the American political space through the Cold War, and that puts him in a position to be kind of shunned from discussions that I think in an honest way he should be discussed in, which we're talking about now, right? The kind of greatness of a lot of his work, right? One more little caveat, right? We have the issue of prolificness, I guess, right? So Neruda wrote a lot, right? Over 3,000 pages of poetry that we still have, right? I mean, this is just a selected, this isn't everything, and you guys saw how big this damn book is, okay? It's hefty, right? The entire collected Neruda is massive, right? Being prolific is good, right? It does not mean that they're all bangers. There are a lot of poems, even if we exclude all the ones that are just nightmare propaganda pieces, right? There are a lot of poems that Neruda has written that are kind of just crap, right? He was writing, it was either weekly or daily odes for one of the communist national newspapers in Chile, and a lot of those suck. Just, they're not good poems, right? The thing is, Neruda wrote enough good poems that those kind of just hang around the wings as a result. You will run into that a lot with very praised literary figures, where you'll look at something and you're like, I don't think this is that good. And the answer is, it's not. Really isn't. It's not a surprise that you find it bad. It's just that it has association with someone who has done great things. So it puts us in a weird kind of, well, we need to look at the whole broad scope of things. When artists become kind of like ingrained in academic discourse, academia becomes obsessed with the idea of what's often called like juvenilia, which is their journals, their early drafts, and so on and so forth. We want the whole picture of how did their writing get to that spot, so the scholar can really dig into what they believe to know about this person. Neruda is much the same, right? Fascinating guy, really long, entangled, and complicating life and legacy, right? But the reality is, he's dead, and he left a bunch of incredible poems that have shaped what poetry looks like. So it is only fair to discuss him in that context. It is also only fair for us to make the note of the stuff that is problematic. Okay, and you're going to see a lot of that come up with Hikmet in Unit 4 as well. Okay, so in the next video, we're going to talk a little bit about the specific poems that we plucked out as reading examples in this. And then you'll have a third little short one that's just essentially some housekeeping. I want you guys to listen to some stuff we need to cover to help you not make some recurring mistakes, we'll say, on your discussion posts, and a discussion of what the first major assignment is going to look like, since you'll be getting it this week. All right. Thank you all so much.